young and the restless spoilers. Amy never truly believed her son was dead. Even as the condolences poured in from distant acquaintances and hollow messages trickled into her voicemail from people who barely knew Damian, a quiet voice deep within her refused to accept it. Logic told her to grieve, to move on, to accept the reality presented before her like a cold slab in a morgue, but instinct screamed louder. She had not seen his body. No final farewell. No touch of his hand. No last words. And while others called it denial, Amy called it motherhood. Because what kind of mother wouldn't question the truth when her son was stolen from her with barely a whisper of ceremony? What kind of mother would quietly vanish into mourning when everything felt so suspiciously hollow? The moment Nate revealed that Damian had been buried at a remote cemetery with a rushed, unattended funeral, something snapped inside her. Not grief. Not rage. A purpose. And perhaps even a glimmer of irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, they were all wrong. Perhaps Damian wasn't gone. Perhaps the lie was far more convenient than the truth. Nate, overwhelmed and distant, had mentioned the burial in passing, as if it were an afterthought. The connection had been bad, his voice staticky and uncertain, claiming that where he was, there was no mobile signal, an excuse so flimsy it only added fuel to Amy's growing fire of suspicion. No one had seen photos. No one had given her a location until recently. The entire affair had been wrapped in silence, and when she asked why, all she received were vague answers and tightened faces. Amy wasn't a fool. She knew that death brought discomfort, but this wasn't grief. It was secrecy. Something about the way people refused to meet her eyes, the way Nate fumbled his words, convinced her that the surface of this tragedy hid something deeper, something rotten. Nate hadn't lied outright, not exactly. But he had kept things from her, and even if he insisted it was to protect her, Amy didn't need protection. She needed truth. On a chilly night when the fog crept like fingers across the low hills of the cemetery, Amy drove alone with her headlights off. The tools she packed weren't ones a mother should ever touch, a small spade, gloves, even a crowbar, but necessity pushed morality aside. Her plan wasn't rational. It wasn't sane. But it was all she had left. She didn't intend to desecrate her son's memory, she simply wanted to see for herself. To make sure. To quiet the screams inside her head that insisted he was still out there, still breathing, still needing her. But as she approached the secluded cemetery where Damian's body had allegedly been laid to rest, a shadow separated itself from the trees. Nate. She hadn't told him her plan. But somehow, he knew. Perhaps guilt drove him there, or perhaps a part of him shared her doubt and needed his own closure. He didn't speak. He just walked beside her, his face drawn and eyes unreadable, and began digging. The earth was heavier than either of them expected. Roots clung to the soil like secrets unwilling to be unearthed. For 3 hours, they worked in silence, save for the dull thud of metal against packed ground and the occasional ragged breath. Amy's hands blistered beneath her gloves. Her back ached. Her knees trembled. But she didn't stop. Not when the first outline of wood began to emerge. Not when the full shape of the coffin revealed itself under the moonlight. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure the dead could hear it. Nate hesitated, sweat clinging to his brow, reluctant to take the next step. But Amy moved forward, wiping dirt from the nameplate with trembling fingers. There it was, Damian. His name etched in metal, cold and final. She looked at Nate, who merely nodded, barely able to meet her gaze. This was her choice. With an almost mechanical precision, they forced the lid open, the hinges creaking like a cry from the other side. And then, silence. No gasps. No words. Just a thick, sickening stillness as they stared into the coffin. But what they saw was not peace. It wasn't her son. Or rather, it was, but it wasn't right. Damian's face was pale, too pale, his features altered ever so slightly, as if sculpted by a hand unfamiliar with love. Something felt wrong, not the natural wrongness of death, but an artificial, grotesque mimicry of it. Amy staggered back, her knees giving way as the image seared into her mind like fire. The face was too still, too flawless, like a wax replica or a mask. The eyes, closed but not relaxed, seemed glued shut, and the hands were positioned unnaturally, fingers twisted as if posed by force. Amy had seen death before. She had held her own mother as she took her last breath. But this wasn't death. It was performance. A grotesque attempt at closure. Amy's scream never came. Instead, her voice lodged in her throat, choked by terror and disbelief. She didn't cry. She didn't faint. She simply stared, wide-eyed, as the weight of every nightmare she had tried to suppress crashed down on her. Nate tried to say something, some justification, but the words didn't reach her. His lips moved in slow motion while her mind spiraled. What if this body wasn't Damian's? What if it was planted? What if the face had been altered or reconstructed? What if, God forbid, Damian had never been in the coffin to begin with? What if this entire charade had been orchestrated to silence someone who had seen too much, known too much? She remembered the rumors. Damian had been involved in something dangerous, something secret. Was it possible someone wanted him gone, but not dead? Or worse, was he being kept alive somewhere against his will? The questions tore through her faster than she could contain them. Nate, now visibly shaken, tried to close the coffin, but Amy grabbed his wrist. Her eyes pleaded for explanation, for confirmation, for anything that could make sense of what she had just seen. But Nate had none. His expression revealed more than any words ever could. He had doubts too. Maybe he had buried his guilt along with that coffin, pretending that what he did was right, that following orders or covering mistakes was for the best. Maybe he thought Amy wouldn't dig. But she had. And now neither of them could unsee the truth. Or whatever fragmented piece of it lay twisted in that box. That night, they buried the coffin again, but something fundamental had changed. Amy walked away not as a grieving mother, but as a woman awakened by horror. Her sorrow had crystallized into suspicion, and her confusion hardened into resolve. She no longer sought comfort. She sought answers. Whoever staged that burial wanted her to stop asking questions. But now, she would ask them louder. She would track down every person Damian had spoken to in his final days. She would uncover every deal, every lie, every whisper. Because the face in that coffin might have worn her son's features, but the soul, the spark that made Damian who he was absent. Erased. Hidden. Or stolen. Amy knew now that she wasn't crazy for hoping. Hope, in fact, might be the only thing that hadn't betrayed her. That hope became a fire in her chest, one that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many people called her delusional. And Nate, despite his silence, knew he could no longer run from it either. He had crossed a line. From accomplice to witness. From comforter to co-conspirator. He would have to choose. Stand by her or disappear like so many others who knew too much. But Amy wouldn't disappear. She would raise hell. If you'd like to continue this story, perhaps exploring what Amy does next, or if Damian might actually be alive, just let me know. I can expand the narrative even further. The earth was still trembling in Amy's hands long after they had buried the coffin again. But what haunted her wasn't the image of a lifeless body. It was the absence of one. As she and Nate stared into the void of that open casket, there was nothing. No body. No trace of Damian. Only emptiness, cold, calculated, and chillingly deliberate. At first, Amy couldn't move. She felt as though the air had left her lungs entirely, as if every worst fear she had tried to suppress had materialized not through death, but through mystery. She hadn't prepared for this possibility. Not truly. She thought she'd find closure, that she'd be able to look into her son's face and say goodbye. But now, the story was no longer about grief. It had evolved into something far more dangerous. If Damian's body wasn't in that coffin, only two possibilities remained: either someone had stolen his corpse, or he had never died at all. Either way, the implications were staggering. Amy's mind reeled. She wasn't new to stories like this. She had lived through Genoa City's legacy of resurrections, deceptions, and buried secrets. She remembered how J.T. Hellstrom had once been declared dead and buried, only to later crawl out of the grave with vengeance in his heart and secrets in his pocket. If something like that could happen once, it could happen again. And Damian, clever and calculating as he was, would know this. He wouldn't confront danger head-on. He would disappear. Let the world believe he was gone. Let his enemies lower their guard. And then, only then, would he strike. If anyone had the intelligence, the patience, and the foresight to orchestrate such a vanishing act, it was Damian. And Amy, standing beside a coffin of lies, began to believe not just with her heart, but with her soul, her son was still alive. Still, belief was not proof. And Amy knew the cost of hope in a world built on betrayal. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. Instead, she locked her terror behind her ribs and turned to Nate with icy precision. He was still stunned, jaw slack, eyes darting between the empty coffin and the unforgiving dark. She could tell he hadn't expected this, not truly. Maybe he suspected something was wrong, but to be confronted with such a naked void shattered whatever illusions he still clung to. She grabbed his wrist, squeezing hard enough to pull him back into reality, and said one thing only: tell no one. Her voice was low, controlled, terrifying in its clarity. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She commanded. Because Amy knew the moment this secret escaped their grasp, it would ignite a war no one was ready for. And if Damian was alive? If he had risked everything to vanish, then exposing that truth too early could get him killed for real. Nate nodded, but Amy could already see the cracks forming in his resolve. He had never been good at containment. He needed release, needed guidance, needed to unburden himself to others. And worse, he believed in trust. Trusted people who had proven time and again they didn't deserve it. Amy knew that Nate's loyalty was fragile, not because he was a traitor, but because he was a man torn between duty and conscience. She didn't hate him for that. But she feared it. Because this secret was not his to carry. And yet, as they left the cemetery, the silence between them thickened into an unspoken threat. If Nate told even one soul, the entire fragile illusion could shatter. As Amy returned to her quiet home, she didn't sleep. Her mind was alive with memories. Damian's last words, his strange phone calls weeks before the supposed accident, the people who surrounded him before he vanished. She made lists, reviewed bank records, cross-referenced names. Who benefited from his death? Who was missing from the funeral? Who insisted on a closed casket? She scoured every corner of her life for connections, suspects, motives. Because now she was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a woman on a mission. And if her son was hiding, she would help keep him hidden. If he was in danger, she would find the threat before it found him. And if someone had dared fake his death for personal gain, she would burn their world to ash. Meanwhile, Nate unraveled. He told himself he wouldn't speak. That Amy's demand was sacred. But silence gnawed at him like a disease. He paced his apartment, reread his messages, stared at the cemetery map he had drawn by hand. It was all wrong. Everything about Damian's death had been rushed, concealed, manipulated. Nate wanted to believe Damian had chosen this, to disappear and later return stronger. But what if someone else had forced him into silence? What if this wasn't escape, but captivity? Nate couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. The knowledge festered. And like a man drowning in guilt, he reached for the only thing that brought him peace: confession. It started with a whisper over coffee to someone he trusted. A doctor who had known Damian briefly. "Off the record," he said. "Don't repeat this." But secrets, once spoken, are no longer secrets. And Nate, despite every rational part of his mind screaming at him to shut up, needed to feel less alone. The story spread in hushed tones, never directly, but through glances and unfinished sentences. And within days, a ripple began moving through Genoa City, a sense that something was off, that Damian's death was not what it seemed. Most dismissed it as gossip. But a few, those who had something to hide, began to panic. Because if Damian was alive, that meant unfinished business. That meant revenge. That meant secrets once buried were now in danger of exposure. Some began deleting files. Others booked flights out of town. One or two began watching their backs more closely, unsure if Damian had already returned. But Amy saw this coming. She anticipated Nate's failure and was already moving in secret, ready to undo the damage before it reached critical mass. She had to keep the illusion alive just long enough for Damian, if he truly was alive, to re-emerge on his own terms. And if she couldn't control Nate, then she'd have to control what others did with the truth he had leaked. Still, the question remained, why had Damian disappeared? Was he hunting someone? Was he hiding from a threat? Was he trying to expose a conspiracy deeper than anyone imagined? Amy didn't know. But she believed in his mind, his foresight, his ability to manipulate the board. He had once told her that revenge was most effective when your enemies had already forgotten you. And that thought now gave her comfort. Because maybe, somewhere out there, Damian was watching, waiting, and the chaos Nate had unleashed would serve only to quicken the downfall of those who had dared wrong him. And if he was alive, if he was coming back, then Amy knew what her job would be. She would stand at the gates of hell if necessary, guard his secrets, mislead his enemies, and carve a path through the lies. Because a mother's love doesn't end at the grave, and when the grave is empty, that love becomes fire. A fire no one can extinguish.